All right, Tory, I got myself in a bit of Twitter trouble this week because I suggested to folks that it was a myth, largely a myth, that academic jobs offer greater intellectual or time freedom compared to jobs outside of the academy. And you can imagine folks got super mad at me. And you can tell what I think of that. So let's talk about this, right? Let's talk about freedom. What does that mean? What are we talking about here in academic jobs? And what does that mean? What are we talking about there compared to the kinds of freedom, whatever that means, right, in jobs elsewhere? What's your first like gut reaction to this claim of mine, this myth?
Well, and I think your claim is perfectly reasonable and understandable why that would provoke anger, right? Because something about this belief of freedom, it's one of these core beliefs that academics hold that when it is threatened, it's like the whole house of cards could come falling down. And so I think it's both healthy for us to actually examine it and say, okay, how much freedom is there in academia outside of it all over? And what do we mean by freedom? And also recognizing that this is something that feels like a core belief that folks are going to respond negatively to, right? And I'm sorry that you had that experience of folks maybe not so being so kind, but I think it shows it's a very real, core belief that has almost a virulent nature to its defense, that it's worth then folks like us who've been inside of academia and outside of it if we can look at it and unpack it and make it a little less charged, folks can take a look calmly at the freedom that they have and make choices in an informed, honest way. No, I don't know. Does that sound crazy?
Yeah. So what do people think? What are people thinking when they think about freedom? So
Yeah.
let me start here. Time freedom, right? So, um, okay, what do I mean by that? The ability to make choices about how you spend your time, right? So that people are thinking like, well, they're comparing it to like this quote 9 to 5 grind, right? That I can make choices about how I spend my time. And let me give you one more. That they can also make choices about um the specific things that they work on in that time. So it's first level is I can, make choices about how much time that I spend on different tasks, but also what the specific tasks are that I work on, and therefore only work on the things that I care about. I think those are some of the things that people are thinking about.
Yeah. Well, those seem like two different types of freedom to me. The time freedom of almost, do I have freedom in my hours? Can I set those, etc.? And then the project freedom, like, do I have freedom over what I work on? And so I
Yeah.
think with each of those we could probably look into, like, how true are those inside and outside of academia?
So there's this sense that academics have, and some academics experience this more than others, that you can do whatever you want whenever you want. And let me acknowledge there are professors out there that teach one course a year, right? And so, and maybe they get to choose how they teach that course, what course they teach, when they teach that course. And so, if that's all we're talking about, like, sure, that sounds like pretty flexible, right? That sounds like pretty free. Most academic jobs, of course, are not like that. And even that person with that academic job, they maybe have a lab to run, they have grants to write, which have deadlines, they have collaborators of various kinds, right? They've got responsibilities to the people that they mentor, that they work with, that they collaborate with. They have department meetings, they have service obligations. I mean, there's a whole list of stuff that they, in terms of their responsibilities. So they might have some ability to make choices, but they got a long list of responsibilities. They're not just free to do whatever, whenever.
Yeah. And there's almost this elevation of total freedom that actually, when you look at it, has a little bit more complexity. And if I speak to it from the other side of sort of having worked in a corporate job in a 9 to 5, the freedom there, the temporal freedom there is layered with a lot of interdependencies. So because you're working on team and working with other people, there's a lot of navigating that sometimes constrains your temporal freedom. For example, if I'm connecting with someone in the UK, okay, that's a time zone thing that I've got to navigate. So those challenges exist. But also, if you work for a company that values their talent and treats them with respect, the notion that, hey, I'm going to go take an afternoon just to do something else. I've got a doctor's appointment, I need to go. The freedom you actually have of your calendar, the freedom you have to set boundaries and close your laptop in any of these careers is there. There are going to be different pressures depending on the work environment, but the notion that any work environment is totally free is just not supported by data. And then the notion that all academic ones are more free than all corporate ones, I think there's a lot more gray there. I think there's a lot more variance in each that maybe we collapse by illustrating it as a dichotomy. And so actually looking, okay, how does this workplace work in terms of time and hours and freedom, that almost on a workplace by workplace basis, we can look at it rather than characterizing one tranche or another. I don't know. How does that sit with you?
Absolutely. And of course, the example I gave is a professor that teaches, a course a year. Cool. Not very many people. Let's be serious. Probably the average professor with a full-time job is teaching more like 3 or 4, even 5 courses a semester. And unless it's totally asynchronous, which probably it isn't, they have to be physically in certain places, physically at certain times for 16 weeks, twice, for 2 blocks in a year. That is very restrictive. And people with regular jobs outside of academia, they don't typically have that many meetings, right?
No.
I see you like
you're not running like a lecture 3 times a week where then you have to prep the content and everyone's going to show up and they need you to have your lecture ready. And I remember the urgency of that for faculty, right? Of actually like, oh, I got a lecture Monday, Wednesday, right? And maybe Friday. And the amount that's a time pressure that you got to deliver on. No, like a typical team project update is like a once a week. You have your key stakeholders. And so it's not as required that you have to show up at that time for those people with content for them. Gosh, that's hard.
Yeah. And tell me about this fear that academics have of like having to work set hours, like the 9 to 5 grind, right? Like I could never work the 9 to 5 grind. I like my freedom too much. Tell me about that.
Well, I think there's also a perception there that conflates all work that's outside of universities, work that's for profit, almost with as though you're on an assembly line, right? And that it's actually like this manufacturing work, which often with manufacturing work, it's like you got to be here these certain hours. The number of hours you're there actually contributes to our productivity. Where if you're in, say, a knowledge worker job, then it's okay if you can get all the things done that you need to get done in 3 hours a day. Great, go do whatever you need to do, right? And actually working in some of these fancy offices, they have places to like relax and connect and all sorts of things. That is part of the job. And so it's not this notion that you clock in with a punch card at 9 and clock out at 5. There may be work situations where that's the case. It's not all work situations. And so again, collapsing them into just because it's not a university, it's this must be at a desk from 9 to 5 undercuts a lot of of possibility that's out there. I don't know if
Yeah.
you've seen that with folks you've worked with, in your own
Yeah.
work, if you've seen that flexibility outside of academia as well.
I mean, most of the folks that I work with have jobs and they still show up to my meetings in the day, right? Because they have that flexibility. Their employers, their teammates trust them to get the work done. I mean, as you mentioned, sometimes you got to have that meeting at 8 in the morning because you got to like deal with the UK team. Cool. But like, yeah, generally. The other thing it makes me think of is that I think sometimes folks are reflecting on their own personal experience, and I can respect that, but their own personal experience is not reflective. So let me clarify. Let me give an example here. The shitty jobs that you had in your 20s, it's not the same kind of jobs that your colleagues who have PhDs are working in their 30s and 40s while you're on the tenure track and tenured.
Yeah.
These are very different jobs, right? Somebody with a PhD who goes out of academia after a postdoc or a faculty position, or even immediately after earning the degree itself, they're pretty quickly, if not immediately, going to move into like what you call the knowledge economy type of positions. I mean, not every single one of them, but like that's very common. And those are the types of jobs where you have a lot of autonomy yes, meet your responsibilities, hit your targets, but also like be a grown up and be treated as one, right?
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting on this grown-up point, because I think one of the things I see around time boundaries in particular, we can talk about the project boundaries and other types of freedom that folks have. But around time freedom, I see that as a dialogue between you and your employer, where you set some expectations of here's how I'm going to work, here's what works best for me, here's what energizes me. And so it involves that self-reflection, that self-setting of here are the things I think are going to work. And the employer then gets to have some dialogue on that where they might ask you to work a little bit later or whatever. And your dialogue there helps inform what the end result is. So it's not completely an employer's fault if it feels like your time is not free. It's also not completely on your shoulders, right? Employers are asking things of you. But if you feel like your time is not as free as you want, there's a dialogue there to then say, okay, can I ask for things? Can I set boundaries that will change the tenor here? And if I ask and the answer is no, then maybe I need to make a bigger change. But I think folks often don't give themselves permission to even make those asks or draw those boundaries. And so their time feels unfree, but many of those limitations are internally determined.
It's a great point.
I don't know if you see that too, but that's definitely something I have encountered.
Yeah, it's a great point. And and of course I know, and let me speak for both of us, we don't mean to be dismissive because we know that this is a challenge for folks. But we do want to remind folks that they do have more power than they might realize, right? Let me
yeah, you have power, you don't have infinite power, right? So it's not that you're like omnipotent superpower, but it's also not that you have zero, right? So finding that middle where you have some power to influence, but not total. I think acknowledging that power, but also not putting all the weight on your shoulders. There's sort of a middle ground there.
Yeah. I was going to say, it would not be a discussion of academic, flexibility without this joke around, academics have the flexibility to work whenever it's like, I'm saying this wrong. Oh no. Oh, academics can work any 60 hours of the week that they want.
And it's really, folks talk about this time flexibility in a culture that actually doesn't have stellar temporal boundaries or expectations. Like there are many folks in academia who, despite crediting the temporal freedom, maybe they're passionate about it. I encountered a few academics in my day who just love what they were doing and would rather go read some papers than watch TV. Awesome. If that's actually you, go do you, like, power to you. But if you're feeling like you have to be in the lab because there's pressure and that everyone else comes in on Saturdays, so I'd better go in, right? Those are aspects of the environment that are not encouraging you to make choices that align with what you want. And again, if you're like, I love being in the lab on Saturdays, that's a different feeling than I feel like I have to be there. And so those feelings of should, have to, ought, those are very different from wants. And I think the notion of academia is that this sort of everyone should want to work that much. And for many folks, that's not a click. That's not something they want. And they might be able to carve out different boundaries in an environment that is more respectful of them.
Yeah. Folks with non-academic jobs who've worked in academia have reported things to me like, I have now had the freedom to discover other interests that I didn't know I had. Right? That's a freedom. I have the freedom to spend more time with my family on my hobbies, right? Etc. That is a freedom I didn't have, right? I might have less flexibility in some ways on paper, but I have a lot more freedom in general in my life.
Freedom to take vacations, freedom to take weekends, freedom to put things down at a 5 p.m. on the Friday. Those are nice things. What about your personal experience, Jen? When you were in academia versus now, how do you feel about your own time freedom?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I did a PhD in history, which is a humanities field, and it's very solo. I think that's not inaccurate to say. And so I had a lot of freedom. The consequence of unlimited boundaries, though, is like problematic. And of course, now I'm self-employed. So I would say, like, for me personally, independence, autonomy, time, like having time for whatever I want to do, is very, very important to me. So this topic actually, like, it gets to me, and I get mad about it because, like, I personally really value this stuff, and it has shaped some of the choices that I make. And so, of course, like, if I'm being snarky about it, I have more flexibility than academics, right? Like, I can do whatever I want once I've got paid.
Well, and it really is. I think the other thing that's underneath what you're saying, which I don't think everyone sees, is you have a right to articulate your own standards for your work. And when those are not met, to move on. Right. And to say, like, I actually really enjoy what I'm doing because it allows me this freedom where other people may have different priorities, different values, and so can look for workplaces that fit, but actually acknowledging that you have that permission. I think a lot of folks don't give themselves that permission. They assume, like, I've got to do whatever's asked of me. But no, like, if you want more freedom and your workplace is not giving it to you and you've asked for it and that's not something that can work, you have the permission to move on. I remember I consider myself someone who has pretty strict temporal boundaries, but there was a manager who I worked with when I was back at Facebook where emails would come in on Saturday or Sunday from execs. And I was sort of like, okay, I'm going to hold on these until Monday because I typically don't work on the weekends. And the response from the manager was, no, if the email comes in on Saturday, respond on Saturday. And so it was this thing where I was trying to negotiate, okay, here's my expectation. The manager communicated a different expectation. And so that's not a workplace I stayed in long term, right? Or not a manager relationship. Each different manager may have a different way they set up their team. But for me, that was something where that wasn't going to work with the type of life that I wanted. And so even though I was in a great job with many great opportunities, moving to a team where the expectation was, and actually the leadership would not write emails on the weekends so that they didn't encourage those type of habits. Gosh, I mean, leaders in corporate, or at least in the tech world, get so much training on how to model those expectations for their employees. And so there's just so much consideration and respect there that I don't think exists in academia. Like, no faculty are getting that training. And so there's more room to look for the workplaces that actually are fostering an environment of freedom, whether it's working for yourself, whether it's working in a corporate environment that has space for freedom. Those things exist and can be more easy to find in corporate than in academia, where there's not a lot of formal training or discussion around it.
One thing I'll pull out from what you said, which is all genius, is that you can leave without it ending your career. And that is like huge career freedom, right? To use that term. Like, that's like the ultimate career freedom that most academics do not have. You can leave.
Yeah. Well, and talk about freedom, like we've talked about temporal freedom, project freedom. I would almost categorize that as career freedom. I don't know if it's for you, but there's this notion in academics that's sort of like you're on the one path or you're off. And so either you're in or you're out. But once you make one choice, it's, oh, okay, I can move here, I can move here, I can move here, I can move here. And so that freedom to choose work environments that work for you, to choose roles and responsibilities that work for you, to find colleagues who you actually enjoy working with, those things are possible. But academia sometimes paints it as this dichotomy in this very narrow path, and that is compromising folks' freedom.
Yeah. So let's end with some advice for folks that are having these thoughts, because, we want to acknowledge that thoughts are thoughts, and you want to make the right choices for your career going forward. So Tory, what advice would you give for folks that are worried about losing some of these good parts of academia?
I guess my main advice there is do the data gathering, right? So if you believe things about jobs that you've never actually talked to someone in that job, go gather some data. And if you gather some data and have a couple conversations and realize that actually your current workplace has some upsides, great. Stay there and see that as an informed choice instead of a dogmatic one. So if you're wondering, could other workplaces differ from the one I'm in? Go out and gather some data, talk to people, listen to career panels, listen to folks like us who are talking about these options, so that you can couch expectations with some level of real gathered data and make choices that are informed. What
Love
about
it.
you? What advice do you have?
Yeah, I would say the same thing in a different way. Collect data about what you want, what you need, right? And give yourself permission and give yourself the time and space to reflect on what is important to you personally, and not just what you have been socialized to value because of the academic culture and the workplace that you currently are in. And a huge part of that, I think, is what Tory said, is go and talk to those people, but also have these internal conversations with your own mind to say, hey, actually, X, Y, and Z is important to me, and A, B, and C, that academia suggests is hyper important. I don't actually fucking care that much.
So important, Jeff, for folks to check in with themselves and actually have those dialogues internally. So I'm glad that you highlighted that. Awesome. Hopefully folks are going to find more opportunity to think constructively about freedom from the things they've heard and find that career freedom from that opportunity they've heard today.
Yeah. Good luck, everyone. Thanks, Tory.